I know you've been covering the conflict on your program, which everyone should definitely follow and subscribe to, Richard Medhurst on YouTube, Rockfin, and Rumble. But I wanted to ask you first. All right. So I know you've been covering the latest developments, especially in relation to now so-called US M1 Abrams tanks are going to the battlefield. Now, there has been, I think, a huge sea change in how the collective West, NATO, the United States are talking about this conflict. It was that there was a lot of enthusiasm about the counteroffensive before it began, and months and months and months talking about how this is going to end Ukraine is going to win. This is going to be the beginning of the end of Russia's so-called invasion. Now the mood has cooled quite dramatically, and the Western mainstream media is really a good barometer in many ways because there's story after story after story. I'm just going to show you one because I want you to react to this in relation to what the collective West is saying and thinking. So here it says there's doubts on how the counteroffensive is showing that Western and U.S. militaries may not be training Ukraine for the right kind of war. So now I want to just scroll down. It says the slow progress of Ukraine's counteroffensive led to criticism of training provided by Western militaries. Some Ukrainian troops said the training didn't reflect the kind of fighting they have faced against Russian forces, raising doubts about whether Western militaries are training Ukraine for the right kinds of operations. But I want to actually go down further because here there's something really interesting. Okay, so some argue, it says that Ukraine lacks the equipment to implement a Western doctrine properly, but Western military themselves would likely struggle to implement this doctrine under certain conditions. What is that? Well, it's throwing in armored columns equipped with, Leopard tanks, Bradley troop carriers, just throwing everything you have, heavy armaments. And as we go down, okay, this is really funny. So, what it says here, I need to just find this. It says here that where is this? The U.S. military, European nations such as Germany, blah 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 blah. Behind this is a deeper war. The rest is prepared for a long war. Well, the point is here is that there is. Now I'm missing the quote because the quote itself is hilarious, but maybe we should move on. What they're basically arguing here is that all the things that you've talked about on your program, and maybe you can go over it. Russian defenses, here it is. In particular, Western militaries didn't tell Ukraine how to deal with obstacles like trenches, minefields, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and dragon's teeth. While Ukraine has made progress in penetrating the first and deadliest of Russia's 3 fortified lines, which I think is kind of questionable, these defenses have slowed the advance and caused heavy casualties. Russia is saying 83,000 now in the last couple of months, 17,000 this month alone. I mean, this is what you've been talking about, Richard. What's your reaction to this? It's almost word for word what you just covered.
I mean, look, before I start ridiculing the media, I'll say one thing. I think it's really a shame, like what's going on, because not only are these countries basically, they used to be one country for a very, very long time during the Soviet time, and also just by virtue of being neighbors. You've got cousins who live on this side of the border and brothers. So it really is like fratricide. You're watching two neighbors kill each other so that someone in Washington or London can make a profit. And I think especially in the numbers you just mentioned, and all these young men that are being like dragged off of the street and forced into fighting. It is very, very upsetting and sad. I only know a couple of things about my my great grandfather, for example. He was shot in the head in World War I in the trenches and lost his eye. And I know a lot of nasty stuff about war. And then his son fought in World War II, and so I think this kind of warfare where you're seeing a repetition of World War I to a certain degree. Not obviously, it's not the Somme, but to a certain degree, where you have these young men that are killing each other in trenches with artillery. It's really horrible. And this quote that you just read right now, with the fact that the Ukrainians were not trained by NATO in how to deal with minefields, or in demining, or negotiating these kinds of obstacles. I think that, this is a joke. It's actually, if we're being honest, it's the Ukrainians who should be training NATO. And I mean that because they are one of the de facto, they are one of the strongest armies in Europe right now. They are the ones that have any real combat experience. It's just ridiculous. I've read many accounts of Ukrainians who've been sent to Germany or sent to England, and obviously the Americans are running these courses as well in Germany and in England as well, and they're teaching them cartography, like how to read maps. Okay, this is a very lovely thing that you learn when you're in the Scouts, and I'm sure they already learned it once in basic. But these Ukrainians that are on the front lines, they're fighting with drones. They need to be taught how to use mortars. They need to be given shells to fire in mortars in the first place. They need to be taught how to penetrate trenches, and penetrate dragon's teeth, and penetrate tank traps. They don't need to be taught how to read fucking maps. Sorry, I don't know if you can swear on it came out naturally because of the frustration. I'm not trying to give NATO any tips here, but it really does show you how ridiculous this whole thing is. And I think I'm paraphrasing here what it said in the article that you just read, but they said something that Ukraine, they're not being given the right stuff, and I mean they aren't being given the right stuff in terms of what they actually need, which are 155 millimeter shells, like for howitzers and artillery. And this is not me saying this. It's not, I'm not just like randomly making up a figure. I'm getting this from the Ukrainians, and I'm getting this from Western officials, and they are saying anywhere between 40, let's start at 27. Let's be conservative. We'll start at 27,000 artillery shells a day that the Russians are firing, all the way to 60,000 artillery shells a day, which is insane. Absolutely insane. That's every single day. So we're talking about production levels that we simply do not have in the West. And there's a very big plant in Pennsylvania, and I always laugh at this because it's in Scranton, Pennsylvania, like The Office.
The Office, yeah.
Michael Scott is running it, and
yes.
It's actually the most
Might
advanced.
As well.
Yeah, really. It's funny because the Pentagon come and they give them like billions to upgrade their facility, which the plant owners are more than happy to take, right? Billions of tax dollar money. They're so happy to like take it. But even with that money, it's going to take them like decades, really, really decades, to catch up to the Russians. I would say 100 years if you actually sit down and do the math. I'm really not joking. Like the Russians,
no, it's
stocking up artillery and producing artillery like you would not believe. And it's kind of funny that the parallels here are kind of funny, that you really do have Ukrainian Nazis that the Russians are fighting. And yes, maybe no one is saying it's a majority of the Ukrainians that are Nazis. No, but there are Ukrainian Nazis that Russia is fighting against. And if we look at what the Nazis did, when they invaded the USSR with Operation Barbarossa, they screwed up because they underestimated. First of all, the intelligence did an absolutely horrible job at gauging, like, how many troops do the Russians actually have? What is, how well oriented is their economy towards wartime production and so on? And so they underestimated the Russians. And then when you look at this analogy, which I often go back to, is that, let's compare the T-34 tank, because this week the American tanks have finally arrived in Ukraine, and everybody is making a big a lot of noise about, Ukraine needs the Bradleys from the Americans and the M1A1 Abrams, and they need the Challengers from us in the UK, and they need the Leopards from Germany, because these are really advanced tanks. They're very good, like, as if the Russians don't have advanced tanks or something. and it's stupid for because the Ukrainians are actually, they've been training on Soviet gear for a century. They just don't have anything other than Soviet gear. So that's one thing I'll come back to. But I just want to say that the Nazis underestimated the Soviets, and then they made the mistake of thinking that if they invest in jet engines, and then you can go get a job at NASA. Also, if you're one of these Nazi scientists,
Which
that,
happened,
they're going to destroy England with V1s and V2s. And then also they're going to destroy the Russians with the Tiger tank. And the Tiger tank, if you go look at a photo of a Tiger tank, it really is the most similar looking to the tanks that we have today. Not that, the T-34 isn't, but it just really is massive. They put an 88 millimeter cannon on this thing, and it is a formidable machine from an engineering point of view. Well, except the first couple broke down a lot. They had a lot of engine trouble. The crew took a long time to train. Does that sound familiar? The parts are hard to replace. Meanwhile, the Russians are building T-34s, which are much smaller. They're very easy to build. They're faster to build. And yes, if you put them next to each other, I think everyone would say, wow, the Tiger looks better. Guess what? Tigers don't win you world wars. The Soviets won World War II with T-34s. And if you look at photos of Berlin, T-34 tanks at the Brandenburger Tor. Okay, so that's what wins you world wars. And we are seeing a repetition of that, in a sense that we are sending all of these tanks that we think are superior, and they are not winning. These tanks, I mean, it really doesn't matter what you send the Ukrainians, because if you have a minefield, there's a minefield, and you have to penetrate that. And even if you did, by some miracle, I don't know how you could, unless you used a nuke. But then, of course, we're talking about nuclear escalation, and unfortunately it is heading that way. But I just want to say that you have so many layers of defenses. The dragon's teeth, which look like concrete pyramids, they are designed, their only purpose is to block tanks. So it doesn't matter what tank you send, it's not getting through. Even if it does, then it will fall into tank ditches. They use these bulldozers to literally just dig a trench that is so wide that even if by some miracle the tank got there, it would just fall in and it could not get out anymore. And then you have the minefields, and then in the trees, the Russians are hiding with tanks, with artillery. They can get you with jets, with missiles. It's an absolute nightmare, and it's sick that you would send young men to get their legs blown off or to die in these tin cans. For what? For what? So people in London and Washington and New York, can make money. The weapons contractors and the arms manufacturers. That's what it's really about. So I think it is ridiculous from a military standpoint, and it's immoral from an ethical standpoint. And it's no surprise that the Ukrainians are not winning. The Russians are not interested in advancing. The whole thing was about the Donbass and the regions of eastern Ukraine, where you have Russian Ukrainians, or if you will, ethnic Russians, who were targeted by the Nazis in Ukraine, who were vilified and discriminated by the government in Ukraine after the Maidan coup. And Russia's really succeeded in the task of just getting them protected and incorporated into Russia, where now they'll be safe. Now, of course, NATO is the other problem here, because NATO is not interested in stopping the war, and they just keep this thing going, and they think by adding Sweden and Finland that they're that they are going to intimidate the Russians. No, this is not the case. And if anyone's getting intimidated, it's actually us. We have a new defense minister in the UK, some fart
Shops.
No one's ever heard of.
Grant Shops. Yes.
Yeah, and this idiot is boasting in the Telegraph that we're gonna send British troops. Like, it's not enough that we're provoking the Russians.
I was about to ask you about this, because Sunak just walked it back.
Yes, yeah. So it's not enough that we are training Ukrainians in England, and the Americans are doing it too, and provoking the Russians. Now he was like boasting that we're gonna send instructors to train them in Ukraine directly. I don't know what difference this is supposed to make, but obviously it's very provocative. I don't think if Russia sent their instructors to Ireland, we'd be too happy. Irish people in Ireland doesn't make us too happy, so I can't imagine what Russians in Ireland would make us. it's funny how quickly he walked it back, because the Medvedev, who is the former Russian president and prime minister, and he's on the Security Council, he's just goes to Telegram. He doesn't give a crap. There's no like press
He does
conference.
not care.
It's on Telegram. And he says that they'll be ruthlessly targeted. And yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's right. It is within the law to do it. You know, we are provoking them. And then immediately, the Telegraph, they changed the piece, and Sunak on Sky News, he goes on Sky News and says, "Oh, actually, it's not true." They'll send them anyway. It's just that the Russians are making them understand that they're not going to get away with boasting about it, and especially not in those numbers. That's what it's about.
Yeah, well, what's always interesting for me is Europe acting as almost like the attack dog for the United States inside of NATO, because at the moment you have the United States completely gridlocked over this issue of whether more should be given to Ukraine. It's probably coming, but it's been the spigot has been a lot less generous of late. But at the same time, you've had of course, you always have Jens Stoltenberg talking about how Ukraine's going to be in NATO, and then you had Mr. Schatz, the new, your new defense secretary, saying there's going to be training there. And now a lot of Western countries inside of NATO are saying that they're going to export arms production to Ukraine. Basically, the military contractors are going to...
They can't even produce them outside Ukraine.
Exactly. They're going to plant their flag and start producing these weapons. But I wanted to just go back to this article one more time, just to ask you about... I don't know why it's not going in. Okay, well, I need to pull it back up, because there's an interesting contrast here in this article that I think kind of sums up what's going on. So before there was a lot of enthusiasm. Now they're saying that Ukraine's counteroffensive was never going to be easy. All the things you just talked about, right? The defenses that the Russians built up for months, the Soviet era fortifications, adapting to the tactics, bigger and more concentrated minefields. And then they say that that while they may lack the equipment to implement this kind of Western doctrine, as you outlined, they would likely struggle to implement this same doctrine themselves. So the question is, why in the hell has NATO pushed Ukraine to fight in this way? That's the big question, because it's been months and months. It was a lot of the people outside of the mainstream media who follow this conflict, like yourself, have been saying, no, you probably shouldn't do this. This is probably a mistake. This counteroffensive isn't going to be as grand as you thought it was going to be. I think it's exceeded expectations and how poorly it's gone.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
even the New York Times is saying it.
Yes, the New York Times over and over. I mean, we could pull up piece after piece talking about how it's going slow. This is going poorly. Politico saying we should have listened to Mark Milley back in November of last year, like over and over and over again. But the question is, then why do they continue to do this? It's just pushing a slaughterhouse at the expense of Ukraine, at the expense of Europe.
Yep.
The United States hasn't felt the relative impacts yet, but maybe that's by design.
It's money. That's the response. You know, I think when it comes to, if your goal is let's pretend for a second that their goal is really to get back all the territory for Ukraine. I mean, they don't care, but let's say it is. The best way you do this, I don't think it's possible anymore. It's we're way past that. But you should have done this with diplomacy. You know, you can actually do a lot more in this particular case when we're talking about Russia and NATO. You can do a lot more just negotiating than you can now. I mean, this is really, really bad. You know, I mean, like diplomacy with the Israelis, negotiating with the Israelis, this is a different beast. You know, a completely different topic. But in this case, it was better to do this beforehand to make sure it doesn't come to this. And the Russians actually tried this. You know, even Stoltenberg, who you just mentioned, was admitting that the Russians sent a document. He's talking about the security framework and architecture papers that they were given in I think late 2021 in around December. So and he thinks, like, he's so offended that the Russians said we don't want any more people joining NATO. And he also proudly, like, he says this as if it's a good thing, when actually he's really just incriminating himself. And he says that, of course, we didn't sign this, and he finds it outrageous that the Russians said, for example, if Poland has, I don't know, French NATO troops in Poland on Russia's border, Russia will take issue with that, because these are not Polish troops, and they shouldn't be there. It's considered aggression, right? So that's what Russia was also saying. They're basically saying, like, okay, obviously we cannot pull you out of NATO. You guys are already in NATO, meaning the neighbors. But what we don't want is other NATO troops being on our border via, your territory by proxy. So that's something that the Russians also said, and he took issue with this, and he really just incriminated himself and kind of just proved that this whole issue was about NATO expansion. And it's not only about that, because you have this issue with Donbass, you have this issue with Russians who live in eastern Ukraine, you have this issue with Nazis, which goes back a really long time. I mean, if it was only denazification, I'd have, I don't think it would really make sense, because the NATO issue is a far, far bigger one, and has been before anyone ever heard of Putin. They've been saying this throughout the whole Cold War, and definitely at the end of the Cold War, especially. They never came to them and said, like, we know you've been smuggling Nazis, in and out of Ukraine with your route lines, and no. The number one thing that they were complaining about was NATO. So it's all of these things together, and now it's too late to do anything. And for them, it's really just about money now for NATO. And Zelensky, I don't know if he really cares as much about his people as he says he does, because he's conscripting people. He's forcing them, drafting them into the front lines. And it's funny because I don't know how many times they've said this in the Western press about, like, they're brave volunteers. There are no volunteers, man. You're a male. You're going to the front. That's it. And that you can also say that, well, that's true of the Russians. I mean, no, it's not. It's not true, because the Russians have not done a full mobilization. They did a partial one. I actually, I know one of them who left the country, and I don't blame him, because he already wasn't. He already did his service in the military, so you can't come and blame him now. But it's just ridiculous to propagandize people in the West into thinking, like, well, everyone at the front in Ukraine is a volunteer, and they're going there just because like they're not fighting for themselves. They're fighting for Ukraine and for all of our democracy. And Ukraine is a corrupt country. I mean, every country in Europe is, but especially corrupt. And this was commonly said. That it not only has corruption, it has Nazis. No one had a problem saying this on the BBC. No one had a problem saying this on CNN until last year. And now all of a sudden, like, we're supposed to just send billions and billions worth, of dollars and pounds and euros worth of weapons. And I just want to say something that this how Al-Qaeda was created, where you had the Mujahideen splintering into Al-Qaeda and having all of these resources. And yes, Osama bin Laden was already rich. We know that. I'm not talking about Osama bin Laden only. They had a lot of funds and resources at their disposal, and training that they had received from the CIA. And then, 20 years later, we're supposed to, cry and weep because America are now the victims and so on. And I think everyone actually did until they invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. Then people started not feeling so sorry for because of that, and that was a mistake, because then they used this excuse of Al Qaeda to destroy the whole Middle East, and now the toll, the victims it's no longer New York. We're talking millions of people in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, all over the place, in Yemen, in Pakistan. Because of what? Because of the CIA giving weapons to the wrong people, right? And even Hillary Clinton will admit as much. So what's to say that all these weapons that are being given now to these Nazis, or, okay, I don't care what you want to call them, let's call them fairies in Ukraine. What guarantees do you have that they're not going to use them to start blowing up people, I don't know, in Russia or in Europe or in South America? What guarantees do you have? You have no guarantees. And it's not just the resources, it's the knowledge. I saw CNN filming a video it's so funny because they try to blur people's faces. It was a British soldier. I can tell from the uniform, and he's teaching. It's like a literal bomb making class, like a classroom with with chairs and tables, and everyone's sitting in rows, and they're looking at this guy in a British uniform whose face has been hidden, and his voice has been pitched down an octave or two, and it's so funny because I know where he's from. You can't hide the accent. He's from Belfast, so he's from Northern Ireland, and you have this very in the Troubles, people would say, well, the IRA are terrorists and this and that, when the British state was actually giving bombs, giving training to these to the UVF and these, which is the Ulster Volunteer Force, and basically these militias that were independent of the state supposedly, but were actually backed up by the British state, by MI6, by MI5, and being given the knowledge and the equipment to go and just kill Irish people, to kill Catholics, to carry out horrific bombings all across Ireland. And so to see someone with a Northern Irish accent, so from Belfast, teaching Ukrainians now to make bombs, and taking this experience, as CNN called it, from killing Irish people, and then bringing it to Ukraine so they can also kill Russians. I mean, I think that's sickening. I think anyone who's Irish who watches that will be vomiting. Like how sick is that? Especially someone with a Belfast accent, who in a British uniform teaching others to make bombs. That has such a nasty connotation with it. It just doesn't sit well or sit right with me.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.